if that's okay. Right, that's good. Okay, so I'll just let us a brief update on some of our upcoming events that we have coming up very soon. Tuesday next week, we'll have our book group meeting online at 7 o'clock. And then we have another online event on the 2nd of December, Friday, 2nd of December at 12:30. This one is on conscious inclusion. If you want to find out more about inclusion, being conscious about it, feel free to join us. And all our events are on Eventbrite, so you can book and then, yourself a slot for that day. Without much ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Musab Hemsi. Musab is Musab is an accredited specialist in employment law by both the WS Society and Law Society of Scotland. He's known for investing time to understanding his clients with a genuine focus on generating demonstrable improvements and savings in his client's business. Musab is also a notary public, a member of the European Employment Lawyers Association, and chair of the Scottish Discrimination Lawyers Association. So for the next 1 hour, please help me to welcome Musab. You can do a clap emoji. Let's welcome Musab. Musab, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lola. Thank you to the team at CIPD North of Scotland and Islands for inviting me. I've never been welcomed with a clap emoji before. That's a first for me. I'm delighted to have that. Thank you all again for giving up your Tuesday lunchtime. I hope you have something tasty to tuck into and listen to me talking about induction in a hybrid environment. So if we can shuffle through the slides to the first slide with the agenda, please, that would be great. Thank you. So yeah, hybrid, is it here to stay? That's the question that I think has been burning on a lot of HR minds, probably for the past 2, maybe approaching 3 years now. Since the pandemic forced many of us to adapt and become agile and move our teams where we can to home or hybrid working, we did so in an almost crisis or emergency situation. And now people have grown accustomed to it. I'm joining you from my own study in North Lanarkshire, where I am working from home today. And the question for us is hybrid something that's here to stay? And what are the key legal considerations for new starters to your organisation in a hybrid environment? I'll speak a little bit about the areas detailed in the bullet points, particularly focusing on some of the employment issues and culture building with some tips as well from me. I know from speaking to some of you before, I know some people I can see on the participants list are current clients of mine, so you'll have heard some of these things before. But yeah, we're going to look at some of these topics and see if we can pull together a clear path for businesses who wish to improve their induction programs for new starters in a hybrid environment. So can I have the next slide, please? As things stand, there is no statutory definition for hybrid or home working. Most of us can identify broadly what they are, or maybe have had some involvement ourselves in being a home-based worker or a hybrid employee at some point over the past couple of years. HR has also been a very shifting landscape in the last 2 years, so some of you may find yourselves at the moment in a new job, which you started either during the pandemic or since the restrictions were lifted, and you have experienced yourself either an induction that was wholly remote or at least partly remote. So hybrid and home working are both forms of flexible working, and the right to flexible working has its genesis in UK law from 2003. At the time, it was intended only to be for parents and certain other carers. But provisions on flexible working can now be found enshrined in section 80F, that's capital F, of the Employment Rights Act as amended, and also the flexible working regulations of 2014. Many of you will know that the long-awaited employment bill has spoken about extending the right to flexible working in the UK, But as things stand, the employment bill has not yet worked its way through Parliament. Interestingly, for any of you that have offices in the Republic of Ireland, they at the moment are introducing new laws to bring them more on a par with the UK's flexible working legislation. In addition to those items of legislation, there are also various statutory codes and guides produced by ACAS, for example, and those are things which employers can take into account when considering flexible working requests such as hybrid or home working. Hybrid and home working takes many different forms like part-time working, flexi-time, job sharing, compressed hours, or term time working. Those are just a few of the most common examples. And what we've found, certainly over the last 2 years, is hybrid working can really morph its appearance. It can look different across different industries and organizations. Generally, when we talk about hybrid working, what we mean is somebody who spends part of their time based at the employer's workplace, usually an office, and partly remote, for example, from their home or a coffee shop or somewhere nearby. It can entail working flexible hours or moving your hours to suit the requirements of your team or your business. Before the pandemic began, some of you will recall that there had been a gradual increase already in remote and hybrid working, but there was a relatively small proportion of the employee population that were working in a hybrid fashion on a regular basis. And some employers at that time were still not fully engaged with the idea of flexible working. The House of Commons Library reported back in June 2020 that the numbers of people working from home at least one day a week peaked at 49%. So when you consider there are a number of professions where it's impossible to work from home, almost 1 in 2 people in the UK working from home in June 2020 is not an insignificant figure. That figure has declined as restrictions have been lifted, and the most recent figure from September of this year shows that 22% of workers across the UK and across all industries are currently working at least one day a week from home, which is still considerably higher than the pre-pandemic numbers. That ability and desire to facilitate hybrid and home working has increased across various industries. In my own industry, in professional services, in IT, communication, and certain other technical and administrative industries, the number of home workers and hybrid workers has been steadily rising. Statistics also do seem to show some disparity between levels of seniority within organisations. Managers and supervisors tend to be more likely to work from home than those who report to them, and this is something that can have implications. For example, difficulty in facilitating successful onboarding and culture building, which will be explored later in my talk. The government's flexible working task force has recommended that flexible working be the default position for all workers post-pandemic. And as you'll likely be aware, there have been various government consultations around strengthening the legislative framework to support the further democratisation and digitisation of work and services to hybrid and home working. One of the main calls has been to make the right to request flexible working what we call a day one right, something that somebody could request from the first day of their employment, rather than one that is acquired after 26 weeks continuous service. But there are other suggestions as well. A strong one being that employers may be required when advertising roles to indicate what hybrid and home working options are available for that role as mandatory. Hybrid and home working can go quite some way to facilitating workplace inclusion and diversity by allowing people to better manage work and family responsibilities, and thereby creating a greater commitment to the job as well. Now, when you consider that this year, the outgoing president of the Employment Tribunals, Shona Simon, for the first time ever, gave a presidential edict or guidance to say that it is now judicially recognised that women take on the majority of childcare responsibilities. An increase in remote and hybrid working options should, in theory, facilitate greater workplace inclusion for those women. Permanent remote working can also widen your geographical talent pool during recruitment. That's something that's coming to the fore, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, as the battle for recruitment and talent wages across the UK. One of the things to be guarded against, however, is the risk of disparity of treatment or discrimination between those who work remotely on a hybrid basis and those who are required to attend the office more regularly. If you treat people differently, of course, that can damage diversity and inclusion. So organisationally, for many employers, that's something that they have to have one eye on. Now, looking at the induction specifically, could I have the next slide, please? New starters in an organisation may have varying degrees of experience with home or hybrid working from their past roles. So induction is a really good place to build foundations and to set your stall out as an employer for what your working culture is going to be. Now, we've seen some horrible examples of this recently with Elon Musk across the water, although that's having an impact for UK-based Twitter workers as well. These mandated emails that say, yes, you must accept that you will come to the office or accept that you will be dismissed with notice, really reflects poorly on the culture he's trying to create at Twitter. One of the challenges for any inductee is how are they going to integrate as seamlessly as possible into the company and assimilate or at least understand its culture when people are not going to be together as often, when there's going to be people working remotely or hybridly, particularly managers and staff. In an increasingly competitive recruitment market, this is one of the things that can set your organisation apart when it comes to both attracting and retaining people. And I place culture at the top of the list when it comes to being a good workplace, making your workplace somewhere where people want to get out of bed and go to work in the morning, and to contribute as much as possible to bring their best self to work. The fear of culture loss is one of the main drivers, I think, behind employers being afraid of promoting an increased prevalence of hybrid and home working in their organisations, or perhaps conversely, those employers who are encouraging more people back to work. It's because of their concerns around what the impact is going to be around culture and learning experiences for staff. I would accept as a premise generally that culture building can be more difficult in a hybrid environment, because in an office space, there's more you can do to influence and make good office culture, and seeking to take that office culture and replicate it away from the office is difficult, or particularly having some level of equity between those who work predominantly from home and those who come into the office more regularly. So, for example, if you spent years building a tight-knit and enthusiastic office culture, how do you then replicate that same closeness within your teams so that people feel heard, appreciated, and productive as new starts join your organisation in a hybrid or home working fashion? Could I have the next slide, please? So one of the things I think you ought to do or take away from this talk is use your induction to demonstrate what your organisation stands for. Use your induction to demonstrate what your organisation stands for. One of the first things that you should do during an induction is to tell people, what is your mission as an organisation? What are your brand values? What strategies do you put in place to meet those? How can people get involved in the overall aim of the organisation? What are those initiatives that you have? Are there events? Are there CSR opportunities? Do you work with charities? What do you do with those charities, and how can they participate in that work? Thinking about how people can ingratiate themselves or integrate with those overall brand values and that mission statement is really an important part of why you attracted them in the first place, and demonstrating what your organisation stands for, so they can be clear from the get-go. This is the business I'm joining, and this is what's expected of me if I'm going to be part of this team. There are social aspects to this as well. When we talk about the close-knit team in the office, if you are going to run social events or encourage teams to participate, particularly new people, at the induction, it's really good to tell them, how do you sign up to these things? What's happening across the organisation? Are there book clubs that I can get involved in? Are there running groups or walking groups that I could join? Are there internal learning and support groups that have been set up? For example, a women's group, a disability supports group, a carers supports group, an LGBTQ+ group within your organisation. someone leading the way on this, or two organizations that I've seen leading the way in particular can be EY and sorry, the name just escaped me now. Ernst & Young, they're the other one. EY, so EY Ernst & Young. What's the other one called? It'll come back to me. So Ernst & Young are, for example, creating a buddying program. So they pair all of their new starts with a buddy, someone who is experienced, but at a lower level of seniority to the person that's joining the business, ideally, so they can start to tell them about their strong support networks, how they can get involved in different activities within the business, how they can build social capital within an organization, but without feeling like there's any sort of master and servant or manager and subordinate or manager and report type relationship. And there are various ways that you can utilize these buddying systems. Many of us will use our intranets, like a getting to know your colleagues section can be a really useful tool. You can ask people to contribute towards an inductee profile, so something that would go out in a company newsletter. One really positive step that's been taken by Scottish Enterprise at the moment is their human library, which has received really positive feedback from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And that requires all new people to come and tell their story, not just what do they bring from a work context, but what about them as an individual? What are they passionate about? What makes them get up in the morning on a Saturday and Sunday? What is it they can bring in terms of other skills to the organisations? And that's how you can find out your colleagues are leaders in the Scouts or Guides, or they're adept skiers, or they're really good at speaking 3 languages. That human library that Scottish Enterprise has created has been a real way of helping their inductees buy into the culture and the inclusive culture of that organisation. And think about the first impression that gives to a new starter during the hybrid onboarding process. Straight away, they'll understand what the business stands for, they'll meet members of their team, they'll meet their new manager, they'll perhaps be assigned a buddy, they'll know a lot about the organisation they're joining and what they can get involved in. Straight away, there's that huge level of human connection, not just talking about work, but planning future communications and events, encouraging people to participate. I want to speak a little bit about where the line manager fits into this, because I mentioned that the buddy ideally is somebody that's not the line manager, in my experience. And Microsoft recently shared their strategy for successful hybrid onboarding, which it's really worth reading, actually. One of the things that they focused on is cultivating the relationship between a new starter and their direct manager, the person to whom they are answerable, the person who conducts their appraisal or their PDR process. They recognise at Microsoft that is time and resource intensive. That is a big part of the manager's responsibility, to really cultivate that relationship with a new starter, even in a hybrid environment. Regular meetings, check-ins, follow-ups, making sure they understand what the person wants, giving them that personal attention they need to help them get through and understand that induction process and quickly become part and parcel of the organisation. Microsoft gave examples in their publication of managers who takes time to set up meetings via Teams or Zoom, perhaps going to visit the employee at home if that's possible, going on dog walks together was another one, just creating a bond between them and their new team member in some way, whether they're able to meet in person or not. We see a lot on social media and in HR publications around people leaving bad bosses more readily than they would leave bad companies. So a huge factor in your induction program, if you want to retain the new people that you are inducting, is building that bond, that togetherness between the direct manager and the new member of staff in the onboarding process. Excuse me. And it's vital, therefore, that managers are trained in preparedness for recruiting and onboarding people. So make sure that your management team, who are going to be so important to cultivating those relationships, are trained on the recruitment and onboarding process, that they understand your ED&I, that they're aware of the company's resources, activities around CSR, other charitable products. What else can they bring to the manager and employee experience other than just direction and instruction? From my own perspective, one of the areas that I think it's most vital to train those managers on in preparation for them successfully participating in induction is on issues such as fairness and inclusion when dealing with a hybrid workforce. So do they understand what the challenges may be for new staff coming into the business, how they're trying to find their voice, how they're finding their place in the team, what personal challenges they may have? Are the managers aware of how they ought to fairly distribute work across the workforce and not prioritise those that are in the office perhaps over those that are working from home? Care should also be taken over how those managers assess their team's performance. Are the managers good at coaching, training, providing feedback to people? And are you confident that they can apply those principles in the same way remotely as they're able to do it in person? Again, management training is such a key part of building this culture and having successful inductions in hybrid environments. You want to make your managers those key advocates of the organization's culture and make them set the standard of putting those practices in place. They don't need to know the answers to every single question, but they need to know how to have good conversations with their new staff, how to listen to them, how to take on board what they're hearing, and how to make sure that they are applying their proper managerial discretion at the right times to support all of their team, not just the ones that are in the office. Can I have a new slide, please? Now, some of the things to think about when it comes to induction and remote working or hybrid working, and the big one for us from a legal perspective is contracts, employment contracts and policies. Hybrid working can happen on an informal basis and can be agreed with employees without the need to make express changes to employment contracts in the short term. And it's possible to operate a very successful, flexible and discretionary approach to hybrid working, but that could then become an implied term of the employment contract if it's applied over a period of time. What I would recommend you make clear in your employment contracts and policies is where somebody is expected to work, where they may be asked to work, how discretion can be applied and how it will be applied. Hybrid working is increasingly forming part of a flexible working policy and procedure. So an employee may be later making a request to change their hours of work or their place of work or their circumstances of work, and managers should be attuned to that. If your policies and procedures are non-contractual, they should still be set out to staff, but it should be made clear to them that those policies and procedures are not contractual. Now, think about some of the key provisions that you want to include in your employment contracts or your hybrid working policies, for example. The key one for me being the place of work, actually identifying where it is somebody will be expected to work, and if there is a minimum attendance at that workplace expected, or whether some flexibility or discretion can be applied. There may be certain things that an employee will be required to attend, for example, certain client meetings, appraisals, disciplinaries, all staff meetings, for example. So think about how those will operate in practice for your member of staff and whether you can do those also successfully in a hybrid fashion, bearing in mind someone's geographical location and their ability to travel as well. Another key feature of the contracts will be their hours of work, and what we find particularly with employees who are working flexible hours is that they may have core hours agreed where they're required to be available for colleagues or for customers perhaps, but they can work flexibly with those hours, and how they are to record that time. Is that to be done through the intranet, for example, or by reporting to their manager? The policy can make clear that it's up to the employees to regulate their own working and to take appropriate breaks. But again, let's make sure that people understand what their hours are, how they want to manage those. And managers also need to have an eye on this as well, particularly with the increasing number of people suffering from burnout because they're working late into the evenings to try and manage too much work at one time. We've seen in some countries around Europe, such as France, the right to switch off, the right not to receive emails, for example, after a certain point in time. I know that's something I've instituted with previous teams of mine at a former firm. So something for you to be mindful of. Their right to daily rest, to weekly rest as well under the working time regulations, and how the business tracks and records their working hours. Remember, failure to ensure that someone has their proper breaks under the working time regulations can lead to both civil and criminal sanctions. In your contracts, you want to record salary and benefits packages. So packages provided to people who work from home or on a hybrid basis should be no less favourable than those who are office-based employees. And any benefits that apply particularly to office staff, try your best to make those accessible as well to people working from home. So for example, if the firm or the business contributes towards a local gym or a gym that's in close proximity to the office, you might want to think about making a contribution to any staff members who work from home for you to pay a proportion of their local gym costs as part of their benefits package. Confidentiality is a big one. You can control the confidentiality in your place of work far more readily than you can control confidentiality in someone's home. So highlighting the confidentiality clauses in employment contracts is important for new starts. You may also have a confidentiality policy in place or your privacy notices that you want to make sure that you highlight to employees and set out what precautions ought be taken by them if they're working from home or in a hybrid fashion to keep confidential information secure. This could be information such as passwords or other confidential papers that they have access to. How are they going to manage that? Whether that's through secure filing cabinets, the use of encryption, additional authentication measures, or something simple like a clear desk policy if they happen to work from home where their partner also happens to work. Monitoring staff has also been a topical issue. And how do you monitor people in order to implement any changes to their working practices, carry out impact assessments, or monitor their performance? This is something that I would recommend you take advice on from your employment solicitor. There have been a number of high-profile monitoring cases where employers have been burned by improperly monitoring their employees. And there is trite European authority which still applies in the UK, case of Barbulescu against Romania, which is a harsh lesson for employers who get monitoring wrong. So if you intend to monitor your staff, whether that's monitoring email activity or other forms of monitoring, please be very careful and ensure you've taken the appropriate legal advice. The other thing the contract may want to include is the right to revert. So if you have agreed that the employee will be home-based or work on a hybrid basis, you may wish to include a clause that sets out the circumstances upon which the business might remove that ability to work from home or adjust the hybrid working conditions and how much notice ought be given. So if the employee is not performing or if they try to change their hours without discussing those with you, the business has some recourse there as well. Remember, unilaterally changing someone's contract without having that right may lead to a claim that you have breached the implied term of mutual trust and confidence and can also lead to discrimination claims as well as a constructive dismissal claim. Can I have a new slide, please? There is a health and safety obligation as well. Various duties apply, set down in the Health and Safety at Work Act and at common law regarding employees while they're at their work. The overarching duty, as many of you will be aware, is to take reasonable care for the health and safety of employees and ensure that you are taking steps to provide a safe place of work, safe systems of work, and safe equipment. So that might mean that you have to conduct PAT tests on employee hardware at their homes. You might want to provide them with training or information around conducting appropriate safety checks at their place of work, make sure they're sitting correctly, a display screen equipment check, for example. Mental health is also increasingly important and an explicit element of an employer's health and safety obligations. So what are you doing to support your staff's mental well-being? I mentioned earlier about monitoring their hours of work and keeping an eye on people working late into the evening when they're working flexibly. Consider the impact that can have long-term. Yes, short-term or to meet certain deadlines, people will have to work harder or perhaps longer hours than usual. But the potential drawback of having that on a sustained basis is the impact of burnout, and also people's mental well-being can be detrimentally impacted. So what steps are you as an employer putting in place to strike the right balance between work life and home life? Simple steps can include having trained mental health or first aid officers in your business, making sure managers are trained to spot the signs of people working irregular hours, if that's not been agreed, suffering from burnout or having any mental health challenges, for example, being signed off sick with any mental health problems. If you have issues like that arising, Make sure that you are supporting your employees through, like I say, mental health first aiders, through any program you may have, it's an employee assistance program you may have, and ensuring managers understand what their obligations are to keep an eye on those employees' welfare and support them through any periods of absence. Another prevalent health and safety issue which I wanted to just touch on is that of domestic abuse. And it's unfortunately increasingly prevalent during this month, during the World Cup. If employees are not regularly attending the workplace or they are at home with their partners during stressful situations, which we do see increases of these situations during the World Cup, it can be difficult for businesses to spot signs of domestic abuse at home. Domestic abuse will impact the employee, of course. It will impact, from the business perspective, their attendance and performance at work. But most importantly, it's highly distressing for that individual and, of course, any children or other family members that may be involved. I know some businesses do put in place a domestic abuse policy and have trained their managers on how to spot the signs of domestic abuse. These can be things like unexplained injuries or injuries which are explained away in a peculiar fashion, a reluctance to attend the office even for mandated events or training or team get-togethers, or other changes in behaviour as well. If you suspect that an employee is being domestically abused, you should be logging incidents and any actions taken, and of course taking advice again from your solicitor on the appropriate actions to support that individual. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Data protection. So data protection, security and confidentiality, I'm sure everyone's three favourite choice phrases when it comes to home working. And as we know by now, UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act place significant obligations on organisations as processors of personal data. Under Article 24, for example, of the UK GDPR, there's the need for any business to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures to ensure and be able to demonstrate that processing of any data is performed in accordance with the regulations. So if people are working from home or in a hybrid fashion, organisations ought to have carried out a data protection impact assessment, and they should monitor any risks and any measures being put in place to mitigate those risks of data leakage or security breaches or confidentiality being breached, particularly if home working or hybrid working is going to persist on a longer term basis. Again, you want to ensure that staff have appropriate training as to the data protection risks that might follow from home working or hybrid working. There may be specific updates to your policies and procedures required, and this should be communicated to all staff as part of their induction programme. Really important to nip this in the bud early on and make sure people are aware of what the procedures are, how to report any potential data attacks, cyber attacks or data leakage, and what the steps are they need to take to minimise the risk of that happening. Some of the steps you as an employer might want to check for your hybrid or home working staff are making sure that their home Wi-Fi connection is secure, so requiring employees to change their passwords semi-regularly and giving employees information on how to choose strong passwords for their home Wi-Fi connection. You may also want to provide them with clear guidance on how they must store confidential documents if they are required to have them at home, and if they're required to dispose of them, how to securely dispose of or destroy those documents when they are no longer required. Depending on the nature of your organisation, you might want to supply your employees with the equipment to do that. So I know some employers provide their home working staff with a shredding machine or locked storage cabinets, for example. Simple policy elements like requiring employees to lock their devices when not in use, and as far as possible to work in a private space are also sensible. So just getting into the practice of locking your computer when you get up to go and make your tea and coffee from home or answer the door for your 10th Amazon delivery of the day, please ensure that those steps are being followed regularly. Also requiring employees to use only approved software. So for example, many organisations insist that only the IT department download new software. to make sure that it's legitimate and safe, and other technical measures can be put in place as well for accessing online systems such as multi-factor authentication, encryption, and restricted access protocols. Okay, can I have a next slide, please? I'm conscious of time, so I'll get a motor on. Thank you. This slide's headed up discrimination. It can, of course, generally be referred to as equality as well. Most of you will be familiar with the definitions of discrimination under law, and you'll be familiar as well with the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act. If anyone doesn't know them, please ensure that you familiarise yourself with these, as they are also a day one right for all new people starting in a business. In hybrid working environments, there are some particular risks of discrimination that arise, particularly, I say, on the grounds of sex and on the grounds of disability, perhaps also on ethnicity grounds as well. We're seeing a far lower number of people from ethnic minority backgrounds applying for jobs where there's hybrid or home working, bizarrely. That's the Office of National Statistics published that information earlier this year. I'm not really sure what the genesis or the basis for that is, but certainly it can be something to be alive to as an organisation. Are you getting applications from a really diverse cross-section of society? And if not, why might that be? And how can you widen your talent pool to make it as inclusive as possible? Bearing in mind that in a hybrid working environment, people can be guilty of direct and indirect discrimination. We see from the Employment Tribunal statistics in the past 2 years that instances of direct sex discrimination and sexual harassment increased during the pandemic. So even when people could not physically be proximate to each other, the number of new claims for sexual harassment and direct sex discrimination in the employment tribunals increased over that 2-year period. A rather shocking statistic when you consider we were all kept apart. I've got some examples of discrimination which I'll just move past to save us some time. Can I have the next slide, please? A few of the things to think about, particularly if an employee wants to move to permanent home working. And it will largely depend on their employment contract. But remember, there's no automatic right for an employee to work from home permanently, or indeed for you to accept any request from an employee to work to change their working hours. Working from home is a form of a flexible working request, which is regulated by both the Employment Rights Act and the Flexible Working Regulations. And we mentioned earlier that qualifying employees are those that currently have to have 26 weeks continuous service in order to make a flexible working request. Although some organisations do have a policy in place that allows staff to make that request sooner. If the legislative position is followed, then employees can only make one request every month. And the burden of any additional cost, detrimental impact on quality and performance, or the detrimental impact on the ability to meet customer demand are just some of the reasons that an employer might reject a flexible working request. And the law prescribes 8 reasons that an employer can turn down an employee's flexible working request. I would take particular care to consider the needs of the individual, why they're making the request, meet the statutory process and time frame, so meet with them fairly swiftly and discuss their request with them, and to approach flexible working with an open mind. The claims that I have been involved in where an employee has been successful in challenging an employer's adherence to the flexible working regulations are largely born from employers just being closed-minded and starting from the position of wanting to say no to flexible working requests. So approach them with a genuinely open mind if you can, and if possible, say yes. If an employee wants to work abroad remotely, so if they've decided they want to up sticks, leave the UK and go and work from abroad, some businesses do allow that, and they have a working from home abroad policy. Bearing in mind there can be a number of other legal requirements to take into account when someone is leaving the UK but continuing to work for a UK-based organisation. Those are not just the applicable tax laws, although that's one consideration. It can also be other applicable labour laws in their country of destination, social security considerations as well, data protection implications can also apply, particularly if they're leaving the European Economic Area. So lots of practical differences as well to factor in, things like time differences, communication lines, and how the employee is going to be effectively supervised. So lots of things to think about, and a few tips from me for success. If you are providing equipment to new starts, make sure they get it before their first day. So where possible, they've had time to set it up before they start work. Make sure your policies and contracts are reviewed and updated regularly so that they're applicable for new starts or anyone who's changing their working conditions to a different form of hybrid home or office working. Make sure you've carried out the necessary workstation assessments and revisit any temporary risk assessments that you may have carried out during COVID-19. Build a culture of communication within your organizations, and in the short term, I would suggest you focus on managers and giving them training on how they should effectively manage their new team members, whether that's in the office, hybrid, or at home. And try as far as you can to be consistent in your application of policies and procedures once they are in place. Considering individual requirements of people will mean that different outcomes are arrived at from time to time, but broad consistency should help you avoid allegations and risk of discrimination. I hope that has been useful, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that people have.
Thank you very much, Musab. That was very educative. Yeah, learned quite a lot from that. I've kept an eye on the chat box. I can't seem to find any question. So I'll just ask if anybody has a question, you can just unmute and ask. If you have any question or even a comment, please unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Eric.
Yeah. So what is the impact if an employee looking for remote work from the abroad for 6 months?
So if somebody wants to work from abroad for 6 months, they will likely require a visa, a working visa for that. So there will be immigration law considerations. You would probably look to amend their contract as well and be clear on what the tax position is going to be. Very often countries will have tax treaties with one another. So if they are taxed in the UK, the tax may be shared between the UK and their country of destination, or vice versa. There may be other social security considerations and some of the practical challenges, Arak, that I mentioned as well, around lines of communication, time differences, effective supervision and management. So yeah, there's a fair bit when people are working from abroad to factor in. Yeah, I would suggest anyone working from abroad, or if you're looking to move staff abroad or bring them into the UK, that is something that you should seek legal advice on because of the number of different steps to go through.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other person? Any other question? Can't see any hand up or anybody muted. Okay. Right, I think, let me just check the chat box for the last time. Yeah, right. So there's no question. Okay, thanks very much, Musab. It's been a very educative afternoon. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone that joined us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you in our next event if you're able to make it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.